do say so myself. I am very excited to be bringing this talk to you. George and Edy Duncan has been a big part of the Spring Hill history and story, and we're glad to finally have kind of their entire story. People who know me personally can say that the entire month of August, when I got my first email from Dr. Finkenbine, has been me talking about George and Edy and how excited I am. Even the ones who didn't know who I was talking about. So, but we're very excited for this. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Roy Finkenbine, and then I will be inviting Barb Whitman, the library archivist, up to kind of give you a little bit of background on where George and Edy's story fits in with Massillon history and kind of what's going on before that. So Dr. Finkenbine is a professor of history and the director of the Black Abolitionist Archives at the University of Detroit Mercy. I have a very long piece of paper. I'm not going to read the whole thing, FYI. He is a frequent consult on museum exhibits, documentary films, and television programs related to the Underground Railroad, and is the vice chair to the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission. That's Michigan's version of the Ohio Friends of Freedom Society that we have here. Each summer he leads an intensive workshop on the Underground Railroad in history and memory. And he has been on the editorial staff of the Black Abolitionist Papers project at Florida State University, has co-authored quite a number of articles and books, and has been the editor of Sources of the African American Past. He's also authored several articles and book chapters on Underground Railroad topics, including the one we were talking about today, Love and Danger on the Underground Railroad, George and Edy Duncan's Journey to Freedom 1820. He has received his PhD from Bowling Green State University, so Ohio guy. Once again, I'm very excited to be presenting this to you, and we'll bring up Barb Whitman first to give you a little bit more information. Oh, sorry, this is what I was going to say. I will be live tweeting this from Spring Hill's Twitter account, which is Tommy the Sheep, 1M, not 2. And if you would like to do anything on social media for our younger social media savvy people, I'm going to be using the hashtag DuncanLove if you would like to follow along or anything along those lines. FYI. So, Barb, go ahead.
Hi, friends. I'm here to show you the actual Duncan Letter, which sits on this table under a nice piece of plastic. I'll put it here. You may wish to come up and see it after the program. This is the letter that Dr. Finkenbine is going to discuss tonight. Now, the best entry into Spring Hill history, if you don't already know it, for those of you to whom this is all new, this subject of Spring Hill and slavery and Thomas and Jerry Roach, the first great entry in the book is this little thing by Ethel Conrad, one of our previous librarians. She did this book in the 90s. You can find this little thing. It's about 78 pages long. You can buy it up at Spring Hill. It's also on Amazon and here at the library. Very nice introduction, big overview about Spring Hill and the Roaches. Are you all familiar with the Roaches on Spring Hill? Know something about it? Well, here's the perfect entry if you don't know. After Ethel's book in 1991, 20 years went by, or even more, and now we have a new book, this one, and I'm going to just pass this around for fun, for a little perusal on your part. Much thicker, much denser, I should say. Here, I'll put that there. Just pass it around, have a look at this. And this was in conjunction with the PhD that I did at the University of Akron. And as I go along and work on these Roach letters every day, I'm finding even more material about Thomas and Cherry that we had previously no knowledge of. That will go into another edition of the book to be published next year. So we're getting there. You see, we're digging out everything there is to know about these Roaches. I should say there are things at the museum that I see Mandy there from the museum. Things at the museum as well that have to be explored and incorporated into a new book as we do local history. So the story is, you probably know all of this. The Roaches migrated here around 1811, ostensibly to improve Charity's health. Thomas Roach's wife is then in her 50s, frail health, since she she lost her first child in 1791 and really never recovered from it psychologically. And I did find a piece today that actually used the word depression, because Quakers, of course, nor did anybody else in 1791 talk about depression, right? And here, right under my nose, is this Thomas's letter to his wife about you have to get over your depression, etc., etc. Most interesting stuff. So then they migrate here, ostensibly for her health, better weather, warmer than New Bedford, you know, cold, nasty winters, right? And so warmer here, theoretically. And good land, just terribly inexpensive, something like $1.50, $2 an acre. So Roach then bought up some property after a search of Ohio, a thorough search of the whole state. He ended up here in Stark County, and they brought masses of records over the years, masses of letters, and all sorts of personal documents, and Quaker historical memorabilia with them, which we have upstairs if anybody wishes to do a paper or a project on these wonderful papers. So they farmed then through the early 1800s, through 1910, through the Great Depression of 1819, the banking crisis, and everything looked bright on the horizon in some way or another. Around 1823, Roach was on his way to a great meeting of friends in southern Ohio. He apparently contracted some sort of perhaps malaria, a strain of malaria that had crossed the mountains with travelers and new pioneers in the first part of the century, and he died suddenly in 1823, in September of 1823. Then charity carried on for another year and did not fare well physically and passed in 1824. So, in the midst of all that then, here then are the Roaches, 1820 harbor slaves at Spring Hill. And with that in mind, I turn the program over to Dr. Bainbridge.
Thank you.
Great.
Good evening. It's one, great to be here. It's particularly good to see so many people who are interested in this story, and it's great to be able to tell the story because I think it's an interesting one, and it's one that has a very definite Massillon connection, East Central Ohio connection. 11 years ago, in the midst of working on another project, I visited this library and used the Rotch-Wales collection, particularly because I had heard about this one document from George Duncan, a runaway slave, to Thomas Roach, this Quaker founder of Kendall, and who was the master of the estate at Spring Hill. And the letter is an extremely rare and interesting letter. It's rare and interesting because, first of all, 90 to 95% of slaves in the American South were illiterate, both by the Master's Act and by state law. They weren't allowed to learn how to read and write. One had to do like Frederick Douglass and steal literacy on the sly. And it appears George did that. Secondly, it's dated August 14th, 1820. This is at the beginning of the Underground Railroad in this part of the world, this part of the country. And to have documentation of that early on is rare. And then it's extremely rare to find a document that's written in the midst of one's movement through the Underground Railroad. Because of the need for secrecy, because the danger of slave hunters, because the danger of being betrayed, all of that was problematic. Well, and as I started to unpack the clues, because George, writing back to Thomas Roach from Bainbridge in northeast Ohio, on the way to the lake, he's passed through here already. And he's writing back and he discusses details. He talks about his route and his trip. He talks about his beloved Edy back in Wheeling, where he has left her as part of a plan where one of them is going to go first, and then they're going to arrange for somebody to help the other one, Edy, to get out. But the other thing I found interesting is this is right at the beginning of the movement of runaway slaves across Lake Erie. It's in 1820 we find the first evidence at all of the ports that were in operation then, whether it be Ashtabula or Fairport Harbor or Cleveland or Sandusky, that were operating on the lake. This is when they have records of their first slaves showing up. George and Edy may have been the first, if not certainly among the first, to cross Lake Erie as part of their escape from slavery. Before long, however, Lake Erie is going to join the Detroit River and the Niagara River as major crossing points for freedom seekers going to Canada. Well, I'll just point out there are a number of factors that make 1820 happen that cause a movement across the lake by underground, by slaves fleeing the Underground Railroad. And I'll just mention two in the interest of time. One is, oops, that didn't work. I think I need to go back.
There you go.
You got it? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm supposed to go this way instead of this way. Okay. That's what I wanted. Okay. Now that we've gotten past the technical difficulty, this is the Walk in the Water. It's the name of the boat. It's a steamboat on Lake Erie. It's the first steamboat to operate on Lake Erie in regular passenger travel. And it begins to operate in 1818. And it begins to make regular, its travel is from Black Rock, which is essentially now a part of Buffalo, New York. And it would travel from Buffalo to Detroit and back, but it would make stops at places like Sandusky and Cleveland and Fairport and Ashtabula and Erie, PA on its route. It's a several-day route across Lake Erie. And so steam travel became important, became regular steam travel, because ship's captains and crews, sometimes beginning in about 1820, would begin to stow people away aboard ship who were runaway slaves and help them get across. The second thing is slaves in the Ohio River Valley, Kentucky, Western Virginia, what today we call West Virginia, and other places, by this time were beginning to become aware, increasingly aware, that they could find freedom in Canada. The 1793 Anti-Slavery Act in Upper Canada, what we call Ontario, had placed the province on the road to emancipation. After the War of 1812, veterans returning home to their homes in Kentucky and Western Virginia brought news about the land of freedom to the north, and this circulated quickly through the slave communities in the Upper South. In fact, John P. Parker, who was a former slave and Underground Railroad activist over in Ripley, Ohio, closer to Cincinnati, claimed, quote, that after the War of 1812, every slave knew the North Star led to freedom in Canada. Abolitionist politician Henry Wilson observed that, quote, many of the slaves, catching at these vague items of information, made them the basis of plans of escape, in entire ignorance of the distance and dangers of the way. So leap of faith. Leap of faith. This generalized awareness of Canadian freedom assumed more concrete form after 1819, when John Beverly Robinson, Upper Canada's Attorney General, made it clear to American officials that colonial authorities in the province would oppose any efforts to extradite runaway slaves. And here's Robinson speaking to American officials. Whatever may have been the condition of the Negroes in the United States, here they are free for the enjoyment of all civil rights, and among them the right to personal freedom. It's no accident the next year, 1820, you see, whether they're going via Lake Erie or Niagara, you see a real step up in the rate of runaways. Word gets back that Canada is not only a place that has freedom, Well, as I said, George and Edy Duncan were among the first of these slaves. George and Edy were the property of Samuel Sprague, who was Commonwealth Attorney for Western Virginia and a prominent resident of Wheeling, Virginia, now West Virginia. When I started looking, using Samuel Sprague as the clue, I ultimately found not only was he a slaveholder, but he was the slaveholder of George and Edy. And the other thing I found using later census data, once they get to Canada, is when they ran away in 1820, these two young lovers, wanting to live and marry and have children in freedom, were 17 and 14. A line I use in the article, I'll share it with you. I said this obscure slave couple displayed the curious mixture of naivete, courage, and desire that is found most often in young. They concocted a plan that they would abscond separately from bondage and reunite near the end of the journey. They fled Wheeling, crossed the Ohio River, moved through a series of Quaker settlements in southeastern Ohio and east central Ohio, then two Yankee farmsteads in the Western Reserve, ultimately crossing Lake Erie from Fairport. Well, most of what we know, particularly what we knew about George and Edy, came from this single letter here at the Massillon Public Library. It's written in August 14th, 1820, from George Duncan, his runaway slave, 17 years old, to Thomas Rotch, and it's written from Bainbridge, only 30 miles from Lake Erie. Rotch, as you know, a sympathetic Quaker here in Kendall, now part of Massillon, had aided George on the way. And as I said, this is a rare, rare document for all the reasons I mentioned, but it gives us an extraordinary look at the process of slave escape and the journey to freedom of a couple involved in this pioneering exodus across the lake. It gives us a whole lot of details about the route they followed, those who aided them along the way, their love and concern for each other, the dangers they and those who helped them face, and their desire to cross over to freedom in Upper Canada. Provides us some other information, and let me just mention a couple. One is it provides us with some evidence and understanding of the Underground Railroad at an early date, a very early date, here in this part of Ohio, this part of what was then called the Old Northwest, an embryonic stage. And we were just talking today at Spring Hill, how fortunate this area is to have this kind of documentation at all, let alone at such an early date. There are suspected Underground Railroad sites and houses across the country that would probably kill for this kind of documentation. Most studies of the Underground Railroad deal with it at a much more mature stage. They start with it at 1830 or 1840, and they presuppose that it is an outgrowth of the militant anti-slavery movement that begins in 1830 and thereabouts. In fact, it precedes the militant abolitionist movement and is an outgrowth of both the slaves' desire and understanding that the far north and Canada are places that can give them perhaps some freedom and respite, but also that because of settlement of certain groups, whether it be Yankees in the Western Reserve or Quakers here in places like Kendall and further south, Mount Pleasant and St. Clairsville, there are people prepared to help them. Secondly, George's letter shows the experience of slave couples in the Underground Railroad. Most slaves who ran away from slavery, more than 4 out of 5, were young single men in their teens or 20s. They usually lacked familial obligations and often had far greater geographic knowledge than women on the plantation or in the home about the territory beyond the side of their bondage. And young women were less likely to run away because frequently they had to care for children. And the prospect of running away with children was extraordinarily dangerous and difficult. Nevertheless, hundreds of slave couples endured the difficult and dangerous task of attempting, the dangerous and difficult task of attempting to reach freedom via the Underground Railroad. Let's see if we, there we go. This is a famous painting that shows a family running away together. The reality is, it was not the norm. But why did couples run away? Just like George and Edy, they ran away because slavery restricted their ability to live as families. Slave unions faced many restrictions. Their marriages were not recognized by law. Often they belonged to different masters and required the permission of both masters to become a couple. They could be separated at the whim of the master. Similarly, if they created families, their children could easily be separated by movement or sale. Furthermore, husbands or fathers couldn't protect their wives or daughters from sexual coercion or outright rape by the master or other white men. If they protested or attempted to intervene, they might be sold. Masters didn't believe that slaves shared a capacity for romantic love. They believed that slaves acted on instinctual attachments rather than human emotions, and this view was forcefully asserted by no less an authority than Thomas Jefferson, the founding father, the author of the Declaration of Independence. Writing in Notes on the State of Virginia, he observed of the slaves that, quote, they are more ardent after their female, but love seems to be more an eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. Their griefs are transient, unquote. As a result, he and most slaveholders had few qualms about selling their slaves away from their spouses and their children. So running away to the north, or particularly Canada, even in 1820, was a way for slave couples like George and Edy to remain together and to more fully realize their love. Well, let's look back and see what we can tease out about George and Edy in Wheeling. This is a scene of Wheeling about a decade after they escaped, circa 1830. Living as slaves in Wheeling on the Ohio River, they found their existence defined to a great deal by that river. Wheeling had become a major entrepot for the movement of slaves into the river valleys of the Ohio River and ultimately the Mississippi River. In 1818, the federal government, major infrastructure project, had built a national road as far west as Wheeling. And as soon as that happened, Wheeling moved overnight into the largest city in Trans-Appalachian Virginia, the second largest city in the state of Virginia after Richmond, and a high volume of wagon traffic started bringing all sorts of goods and people into the city, including slaves. The city developed into a hub for the river-bound slave trade, and from Wheeling, traders took their human cargoes southward down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to regional slave markets in Louisville, Memphis, Natchez, and New Orleans. Benjamin Lundy, who was part of those Quaker communities right across the river for a while, became a well-known abolitionist later. He characterized Wheeling as a great thoroughfare for the traffickers in human flesh. Their coffles passed through the place frequently. I heard the wail of a captive. I felt the pang of his distress. Well, if you're a slave in Wheeling, like George and Edy, you lived in constant fear of being sold down the river. That's where the phrase comes from. Sold down the river. And for slave women like Edy, there's an even greater danger of being marketed as fancy girls, that was the term, to serve as sexual playthings for rich white men in New Orleans. Often the most highly sought after were young teenage girls. One slave dealer described the particular attraction of, quote, a young, handsome, yellow girl, light-skinned black, yellow girl of 14 or 15, long curly hair. Well, although they probably worked as domestic servants for Samuel Sprigg, this important man in Wheeling who owned them, George and Edy likely understood their situation, the prospect for sale on the river, and the fact that they were investments in Sprigg's portfolio. I didn't understand this at first when I looked at the census. And the census of 1820 lists 15 slaves in Sprigg's household. He had just developed a large country estate northeast of the city named Waddington Farm. It is on the location, if any of you know Ogilvy Park. That's where it is. Okay. And the census shows there are 15 slaves in Sprigg's household, 13 of whom are 25 or younger, and a majority of whom are under 14. When I first saw this, I thought, what's going on here? And then I started to read about the business strategies of slaveholders, and in fact, this was his investment strategy. Slave children could be purchased relatively cheaply and would dramatically increase in value as they grew in age. Young male slaves would be marketable as prime field hands. Young female slaves would be sought after for their procreative value, or in some cases as fancy girls. Do any of you know the book Slaves in the Family? You heard of this? It got a lot of splash about 10 years ago. It was written by a man, now a writer named Edward Ball, who's like a 5th or 6th generation from the Ball family, who were the leading rice planters in the Carolinas. And many people who think they're important, they kept their papers. There's excellent documentation, just massive. And so Edward Ball used it to tell the Ball family story, including the black Ball members that had come from this. Second Elias Ball, who in the late 18th century was the patriarch of the wealthy Ball family, urged his heirs to do 2 things with their money, their wealth. He says, 1, you can increase it by lending it out at interest, or 2, you can do it by buying young slaves. So it's an investment strategy. George and Edy likely understood this strategy and lived in perpetual fear of being sold. To act in this fear, they'd have to flee across the river. To become a couple, they'd have to flee across the river. And freedom lay just across the river on the Ohio side. Legally, this had been established by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which prohibited slavery in the Old Northwest, and by the admission in 1803 of Ohio as a free state. Practically speaking, this was reinforced by the actions of residents of the Quaker settlements in the southeastern part of the state. By the mid-20s, some 8,000 members of the Society of Friends had left the South over the slavery issue and taken up residence in the 4 Ohio counties closest to Wheeling: Belmont, Jefferson, Harrison, and Columbiana. Furthermore, 2 Quaker villages, Mount Pleasant and St. Clairsville, were less than 12 miles away from Wheeling, and both welcomed and protected runaway slaves. I won't go into some of the detail in here, but slaveholders became very angry because they claimed to understand by 1820 that the Quaker residents of these 2 communities and communities around them were encouraging their slaves to run away and, in fact, helping them run away. One complaint in the Wheeling press from a slaveholder says that these communities, quote, robbed the master of his property and put it in the hands of an illegal master. I think what they mean by that, that the folks that are helping them run away. Well, the Ohio Yearly Meeting of Friends was based in Mount Pleasant, and it made it possible for Quaker activists there to easily network with other Quakers across this part of eastern Ohio in aiding and protecting runaway slaves, including the Roaches here in this area. Well, with freedom just across the river and the danger of being sold down the river ever present, slaves in Wheeling regularly took flight. They crossed in a variety of ways. In the early 19th century, prior to the construction of locks and dams, the river sometimes became shallow enough to walk or swim across, especially in the summertime when George and Edy would have escaped. Occasionally, runaways found an abandoned skiff, or a sympathetic white or free black willing to row them across. Slaves also absconded with the assistance of Quakers from Mount Pleasant and St. Clairsville, who visited the markets in Wheeling and returned with fugitives concealed in their wagons, crossing at Martin's Ferry a few miles to the north. As a result, there was a steady flow of slaves over the river during the years leading up to the Civil War. When black abolitionist Charles B. Ray of New York City visited Wheeling a couple decades later in 1839, there were only a few dozen slaves in a population of 12,000 in Wheeling. He was told by an informant, quote, "This place has become nearly free by voluntary elopement. As soon as they are sufficiently old to be of any service to their masters, they are off to provide for themselves. The best of all was that none have recently been overtaken who've exercised this inalienable right." And his informant went on to assure him that he, quote, "had known slaves to be missing, and in 15 minutes a strict search set on foot to no possible purpose, and they were never heard of unless by intelligence from Canada, letters, etc." But the summer of 1820, George and Edy had fallen in love. They've got this fear of being sold down the river. They've got this fear of being separated. They want to raise a family. They're determined to strike out for freedom, and they concoct a plan. Possibly sensing the particular danger posed by running away together as a slave couple, they were much more obvious, they were much more identifiable. They looked more out of place than just an individual black man who might be on, or a woman who might be in a task, particularly one who might be in a task with their master. So the plan was George would run away first. Once he'd reached a place of relative safety, he put a scheme in motion to effect Edy's escape. Until then, Edy was to remain at the residence of John Brady, a prominent local figure in West Liberty, Virginia, a village just outside Wheeling, and in slave territory. It's unclear, we just don't have the evidence, was she somebody who was being hired out, as it was often done, by Sprague, her owner, to work at John Brady's, or was John Brady a sympathetic soul who was hiding her from Sprague? We don't know. But George begins his journey by crossing the Ohio River and seeking assistance at the Quaker settlements on the other side. Just quickly point to some places on the map. You can see it. Here's Wheeling, here's West Liberty. Here are these villages, St. Clairsville, Mount Pleasant, the Ohio River, and here's Kendall up here. The first really documented stop on George's journey to freedom came here at Spring Hill, and I won't go into reiterating what Barbara expressed so well, and if you want to go deeper, there's sources that she laid out. Spring Hill's at the confluence of at least two fairly new underground railroad routes that were being used. One is running up from Cincinnati, and Ripley combines in Champaign County, Ohio, continues to run northeastwards through a series of Quaker settlements and ends at Spring Hill, where it networks with others. In the southwest, this was in place by 1820, according to pioneering historian of the Underground Railroad, Wilbur Siebert. The second one that Siebert talks about being in place actually ran west from Wheeling to St. Clairsville, to Bainbridge, to Coshocton, up to Kendall, where it would hook to begin again with established route being established, I'll talk about later. The other possibility, and the one George may have taken, may have involved his Quaker connections, because George was a very active member of the Ohio Yearly Meeting of Friends, which was headquartered at Mount Pleasant, and he was active in all sorts of Quaker Ohio Yearly Meeting committees, including ones that dealing with slavery, dealing with African Americans, dealing with Indians, and so forth. He had this network, and it's very possible that in ways completely out of sort of any defined route, that these folks here in Mount Pleasant, because of their connections to Thomas and Charity Roach, got them up to Kendall. We don't know. But once they get here, then we have a pretty good sense of what happens. There's also another possibility, and that is they could have had some inside assistance from folks in Wheeling. We don't know, but one thing we do know is Charity, while Spring Hill was being built in the winter literally established by Thomas Roach in the winter of 1811, 1812, Charity was staying in Wheeling and had a good knowledge of town and built relationships like that. Well, Thomas had, as I said, connection with committees. He became more and more concerned about a couple issues in the voluminous Rotch-Wales collection. Among the letters are letters that he's writing to other Quakers in places like Ohio and Indiana and Washington, D.C. and other places around the country in the East, in which he's discussing concerns about slavery, concerns about the kidnapping of slaves. Kidnapping was a term that was often used in the pre-Civil War period for, that's it, kidnapping slaves, kidnapping free blacks, for taking someone who was legally free, who may have had papers, and illegally capturing them, taking them to slave territory, mocking up slave ownership papers, and integrating and selling them into the slave economy. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, that's what happens to Solomon Northup. He's kind of the quintessential example of that. And so Thomas and Charity, it seems, are becoming very concerned about that. And another thing's happening along the river. In the wake of the War of 1812, runaway slaves who had made it along the river and been protected in kind of farming settlements and other communities north of the river now were being more and more pursued by either Kentucky or West Virginia slave catchers who were coming across and trying to capture them, as well as kidnapping free blacks. So a way to seek protection was to get further away from the river, and that meant going to northern Ohio, or likely going to Canada. Well, the problem of protecting runaway slaves and fending off kidnappers soon came to Thomas and Charity's doorstep. Moved by, I just mentioned, for those of you who haven't seen the book, this may or may not be the silhouettes of Thomas and Charity Roach. Okay, it's not certain. Ethel Conrad said, I think, probably 50-50 proposition, something like that, right? It could be relatives of theirs in the Roach family. Well, moved by conscience and their Quaker faith, Thomas and Charity Roach begin welcoming runaway slaves to Spring Hill in the spring of 1820. This outbuilding would have existed then, I believe. The home was built in 1821, so it's kind of anachronistic to show the home. But use what illustration you have. Prior to George and then apparently Edy getting there, the first to arrive was a slave mother and her 2 children. They're not named in the evidence, but they turn up in the Perrin's Antiquarian History of Stark County. After ascertaining they were runaway slaves, Thomas offered them shelter in the second story of his log spring house. The next morning, 2 strangers ride up on horseback, inquiring if they had found the Roach residence. Receiving assurance that they had, one of the strangers identified himself as DeCamp, who's this real shadowy figure. I've been able to find mentions of him over the course of 2 decades, and he had a reputation for engaging in slave catching and kidnapping along the north side of the Ohio River, but there's not a lot of details. He kept under the radar. He is definitely operating in a kind of subterranean economy. Sources in Stark County allege that he, quote, was in the habit of aiding slaves to escape, advising them what route to take, then following them for the reward offered by their masters. Shady character, right? The camp sought the reward offered for the 3 slaves hiding at Spring Hill and insisted that he get them under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which was then the act in operation. In spite of his Quaker pacifism, Thomas refused to deliver the runaways and informed The two strangers, and listen to this is good Asmus Quaker. Thou might have trouble to take them. He warned the camp, quote, I expect very soon to have some business with thee, and it will be well for thee to be prepared for it. I refer to that as Thomas Roach's make my day line. Noticing that the Roach farmhands had formed a circle around them and looked to be willing to act with a good bit of resolve, the camp and his companion opted for retreat. Well, the camp's intrusion at Spring Hill and the danger presented by other potential slave catchers meant that Thomas and Charity and the runaway slaves who came to them lived with an ever-present sense of danger. During his time there, George used the assumed name of Jack and worried if Sprague or someone in his employ might track him to the place. And although she supported the effort to hide and protect the runaway slaves like George, Charity was nervous whenever slaves were in the household. Over time, this took a substantial emotional toll. She describes the work and her response in an 1821 letter to her sister. Night before last, we had a consignment of 2 Negro men and a little boy fleeing for their life to Canada. Poor things, they excited so much sympathy and so prey upon my feelings that I should be glad to have but little of their company. We procured a man to go with them last night to put them on their way, the day having mostly been spent in providing food for them. About half an hour after they went, a person knocked at the door, and who should it be but another Negro of the same description. He was anxious, though very much fatigued, to overtake the others, and after provisioning another decoy, we posted them away and were truly glad to be released so soon. But while Charity wrestled with the emotional anxiety produced by the dangers of their Underground Railroad work, Thomas grappled with matters of the law. About the same time that DeCamp came to Spring Hill, another fugitive slave case also roiled his mind and prompted him to seek legal advice. The case involved Martin and Sam, slaves of cousins Edward B. Jackson and Jonathan Jackson of Clarksburg, Virginia. The latter, Jackson, would become the father of Thomas Stonewall Jackson of Civil War fame. After nearly reaching Lake Erie during their escape, a runaway slave advertisement for them appeared in the Cleveland Herald on May 9, 1820. And they were captured in Independence Township near Cleveland by slave catcher Joseph Keeler, working with Peter Comstock, a local justice of the peace. If anybody needs evidence that there were people on both sides of the issue, even in northern Ohio, that is it. As the captors passed through the village of Hudson while taking the 2 slaves back to Virginia to claim a $500 reward, a crowd of local citizens, including a young John Brown and his father, rescued the bondsmen, sent them on their way to Canada, and persuaded local authorities to arrest the captors for kidnapping. Although many opponents of slavery viewed this as a victory, Thomas worried about Comstock's conduct, as he termed it, and the possibility a local magistrate would find him in violation of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 for his work in aiding runaway slaves. Over the next 2 years, he regularly consulted James W. Lathrop, an attorney in Canton, on the issue. Lathrop sought to assure him with his interpretation of the law that his liability was limited as long as he didn't play an active role in removing a runaway from a slave state. Keep that in mind for later. Well, both of these cases, which preceded George's arrival at Spring Hill in August, left Thomas and Charity on edge. Although George developed trust, respect, and affection for the Roaches, he sensed that Kendall lacked the safety that he sought, and he chose to continue his journey, and quickly. Well, the remaining 80 miles of George's journey to freedom, the leg between Spring Hill and Lake Erie, is also relatively well documented. Siebert, the pioneering Underground Railroad historian from Ohio State, identified this segment of the Underground Railroad being in place by 1820, and George reiterates that same route in his letter. From Kendall, George would have traveled northeastward to Suffield in the next county. Some 20 miles, here he enters the Western Reserve, a portion of northeastern Ohio that has recently been settled by migrants from New England and upstate New York, primarily from Connecticut. Thomas, or one of his Quaker associates in Kendall, probably accompanied the runaway on this part of the journey. At this point, the primary Quaker section of the emerging Underground Railroad in eastern Ohio connected with a section operated by Yankees. That was actually an ethnic term in the 19th century, if you don't know that. It was not just a baseball team. People of New England, upstate New York, English stock, English Protestant stock, were considered an ethnic group called Yankees. In Suffield, George was aided by Martin Kent, a 59-year-old Congregationalist farmer who migrated to the area 15 years before. And George's stay at Suffield must have been relatively uneventful. He says little about it in his letter. From Suffield, the route ran some 28 miles northward to Bainbridge. Where Martin Kent guided George to the farmstead of his 27-year-old nephew, Elihu L. Kent. Like his uncle, the younger Kent had left Connecticut in 1805, and he'd arrived at Bainbridge some 6 years later, the third family to come into the settlement. And after an attempt with his father to open a dry goods store, he decided to farm the fertile land nearby. From what we know at the time, the journey that George, and perhaps anyone accompanying him, took between the two villages must have been lonely and foreboding. Contemporary descriptions note that, quote, forests covered the whole face of the country for miles around, and neighbors were few and widely separated with roads nearly impassable lying between. But upon reaching Bainbridge, George had to be pumped, because he found a circle of friendly Congregationalist farmers with a clear desire to aid the runaway slaves who came into their midst. And he informs Thomas in the letter back to Thomas Roach in Kendall, quote, I am treated extremely well by the people. He also found a friendly face from Wheeling. Upon entering the log house at the Kent farmstead in Bainbridge, he reunited with Thornton Taylor, a runaway slave and a friend from Wheeling, and they made plans to cross Lake Erie together. George felt relatively safe in Bainbridge, perhaps for the first time in his journey. He wrote a letter to Thomas recounting portions of the route northward, sharing his real name for the first time, George Duncan, and intimating to him, quote, I think a sprig was here who could not get me, for I'm with the Yankee people, and they are avowed enemies of slavery. He also felt little pressure to immediately resume his journey, referring to Bainbridge as, quote, where I reside now. Nevertheless, as a precaution, he continued to use an assumed name around the Kents, this time calling himself Jake. In his letter, he urged Thomas, quote, to let no one know that Thornton and I are traveling together. He also sensed the time was right to put in place the plan to get Edy out of bondage. That was the key purpose of his letter to Spring Hill. He sought to persuade Thomas to go into Virginia and lead Edy across the Ohio River and as far as Spring Hill. Given Lathrop's legal advice, Thomas Roach, this must have placed him in a quandary. George informed him that Edy was living with John Brady in West Liberty, but he also said there are other sources of help. Noting the importance of free blacks on the Ohio side of the river in the Underground Railroad work, he urged Thomas to contact a man named Benjamin Jones, a man of color, there, if he had difficulty in locating and extracting Edy. He also enclosed a note to Edy expressing his affection and assuring her it was safe to set out, his words, with Thomas, although he cautioned her, quote, to not mention anything to Thornton's wife respecting him, fearing that word might get back to Sprague and endanger their progress. After Thomas had succeeded in getting Edy to Spring Hill, George wanted him to direct her along the same route he followed. Kendall, Suffield, Bainbridge, Fairport. Once at the Kent farmstead near Bainbridge, she was to wait for a letter from him in Canada and proceed across the lake. He had no doubt that Elihu Kent would, quote, go with her and get her on board a vessel to Canada. Well, the final step in George and Edy's flight to freedom would be to cross that body of water, Lake Erie, which just becoming an extension of the Underground Railroad in 1820. In his letter, George stated his intention to, quote, start for Canada in about 2 weeks. Well, he wrote the letter August 14th. By all accounts, he was heading to Fairport Harbor. On August 26th, according to the steamboat schedule for the Walk in the Water, it would arrive at the opening of the Grand River, mouth of the Grand River at Fairport Harbor. Almost certainly he and Thornton traversed the 30 miles northward, probably accompanied by Elihu Kent, and boarded a vessel at Fairport. Samuel Butler, a tavern keeper there, often hid and assisted freedom seekers in gaining passage on steamboats that anchored at the river's mouth. The only steamboat traversing the lake at the time of George's escape was the Walk in the Water, a 320-pound craft piloted by a man named Jedediah Rogers that we know later helped other runaways across the lake. Well, in less than 2 days into its voyage from Fairport, the Walk in the Water arrived at Black Rock, now part of Buffalo, but at that point a separate entity that was the port for Buffalo. It was on the mouth of the Niagara River, and it's likely that after making it to Bainbridge, Edy took the same route across the lake, and in all likelihood, George and Edy reunited at Black Rock and took the ferry that regularly carried passengers, including runaway slaves, to the Canadian side, who would have found freedom. Here is Fairport, Black Rock, the Niagara River. Okay. And here's Niagara. I'm going to mention that in a moment. We don't have any record of George and Edy's arrival on Canadian soil, but it may have approximated the experience of another group of fugitives who reached Niagara, now named Niagara in the Lake, a few years later. An observer who saw this recounted, quote, I saw one day a party of 11 black people land. They were all escaped slaves, men, women, children, and their action in landing was indelibly impressed on my memory. I shall never forget how they all knelt down and, kissing the ground, fervently thanked God, the tears streaming down their faces that they were now in a free country. George and Edy settled into the relative safety of Niagara. They would live there during the 1820s and 1830s, getting married, establishing a family. 4 children were born during the time there. Charles in 1826, George in 1830, Ellen in 1832, and Cinderella, likely a variant of Cinderella, in 1836. Remembering their own experience as freedom seekers, they welcomed and they aided newly arrived runaways from southern bondage. Niagara's black community, no more than a few dozen people in 1820, consisted of black loyalists who came north after the American Revolution, former Canadian slaves, and a growing number of runaways from the American South. Most lived in what was then called the Colored Village, in the southern part of the settlement, where life revolved around 2 churches, one Baptist and one Methodist. It must have seemed like heaven to George and Edy in 1827 after the provincial Parliament passed the Common School Act, which allowed George and Edy's children to have access to public education. Well, the Duncans probably felt relatively safe in Niagara until the spring of 1837, when the case of a runaway named Solomon Mosby reminded them of the risk of living so near the border with the United States. His Kentucky master tracked him to the town and sought to have him extradited for stealing a horse in the course of escape. Canadian authorities hesitated at first, but eventually allowed the extradition request. But black residents rioted and made it possible for Mosby to escape. Even so, the affair provoked fear among the black residents of Niagara. I wonder if George, for example, was among the rioters. He knew what freedom meant. runaway, Sarah Carter, was interviewed a year later by a white writer who came through town, and she spoke to these concerns. When she told the visitor, quote, "I thought we were safe here, and I thought nothing could touch us here on your British ground. But it seems I was mistaken. And if so, I won't stay here. I won't. I'll go and find some country where they cannot reach us." Well, not long after this episode, probably in the early 1840s, the Duncans decided to move further into Upper Canada, which in 1841 would be renamed Canadian West, Canada West. It's what we now call Ontario. They were seeking the promise and protection of the Canadian wilderness. At the time of the 1851 census, when I discovered that they were 17 and 14, they were living in Cayuga, later North Cayuga Township in Halton County, on land that had formerly belonged to 6 Nations Indians, but was opened in the early 1840s to white and black settlement. It's just kind of southwest of Hamilton. Okay? Grain grew well in the rich black soil, and there were valuable stands of timber all around. Their married sons, Charles and George, worked nearby farms, and their daughters lived with them in their one-story log cabin. When abolitionist missionary Hiram Wilson visited the colored settlement late in that year, he found a thriving community of 24 black families, most headed by former slaves from the South, each living in what he called, quote, "a comfortable log cabin," and usually from 20 to 30 acres of cleared land. He observed that, quote, "he found the people generally cheerful, contented, and happy, and the majority in quite comfortable circumstances." Well, in 1861, in the census, George and one of his daughters were still living there, although Edy had passed. In 1871, in the census, George resided with his son Charles, but now they had moved to nearby Seneca Township in Halton County, and another black farming community that had formed around an African Methodist church there, actually on Duncan Letter. Local sources indicate that his son, quote, "was something of a leader among his fellow black residents of Seneca." We don't know the year of George's death. Well, what happened to the Duncan family? They remained proud Canadians. Many of their children and grandchildren continued to live in Seneca Township into the 1890s. Now a number of their descendants live in Hamilton, Toronto, and other cities. When I first contacted the Halton County Library and Archives, they contacted me back, and it was a joyful moment, because they said, "Would you like us to scan and send the Duncan family file," which was fairly thick and had newspaper clippings, had all sorts of details. The Duncan family became very important in Halton County history. The Duncans have contributed to Canadian society as teachers, businesswomen, businessmen, railroad workers, and in myriad other ways. A grandson, Charles, even fought bravely with the 114th Regiment of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces in Europe during World War I. The family has a photograph of him standing proudly in his uniform. After the war, he, quote, "lived a life of relative fame in Cayuga, serving for decades as the police constable there." And that probably seemed strange to some people at that time, that a black man was the police constable. On his 100th birthday, he received congratulatory correspondence from Queen Elizabeth II, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, and many other Canadian leaders. No doubt George and Edy would be proud of the legacy left by their journey to freedom. Well, let me close with one final statement about the importance of this story and where it fits. This is a man named Clement L. Vallandigham. If you don't know Clement, don't remember him from your mandatory 8th grade American history with Mrs. Lee. Clement Vallandigham was the most anti-Civil War person in the North. He was a politician that hated Lincoln, hated what Lincoln was done, and ultimately was kicked out of the country because of his anti-war activism, and became the prototype, if you had to read this in college, high school, or heard of it, Edward Everett Hale's short story, "The Man Without a Country." It was modeled after him. Well, he was kicked out. And he ran for the governor of Ohio in 1863 from Windsor, Canada.